Demo 3, creating an ASP.NET Web API service. What we are going to do is we're going to start off a version of Visual Studio. So here's Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new project. So let's do a File, New Project. Now, obviously, I'm creating a web application here to host web services. So that's not something we can do in Synergy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for a Visual C# web, and I'm going to create an ASP.NET web application for the .NET framework. You can see here's the web application for the .NET Core environment. So obviously we're doing .NET framework. And I am going to put this thing in C:\dev demos, and I'm going to call it web server, and I'm going to put it into a solution called web API example. We'll have a directory for the solution. I'm going to create a new Git repository as well in the framework, because later I'm going to publish all of this code out on Git. So let's go ahead and create the new web application. When you create a new ASP.NET web application, you get this little wizard that is basically configuring the environment for us. And you've got various options. Do you want to start totally from scratch? Are we doing an old ASP.NET Web Forms application, building an MVC website? Are we doing a web API service, single page application, and so on? So I'm going to pick web API. Notice that also has MVC built in. So this is an ASP.NET MVC web application with the ability to do web API. Okay, so I'm not going to do authentication, but you can actually go off and say, I want to do single user account authentication, which plugs in code for the Microsoft Identity Framework. That's a roles-based authentication system that basically uses usually a SQL Server database to propagate data. You can do work or school accounts if you want to integrate with Microsoft ID kind of thing. You can do Windows authentication if you're in a local area network type scenario and have an Active Directory and so on. So, you know, there are various options for doing authentication. One of the individual user accounts, by the way, you can configure it to do, once you've got individual user account support, you can go into the code and turn on login with Facebook, login with Twitter, Google, Microsoft accounts, all of that kind of stuff as well. But for today, we're just going to keep it simple and just do a totally open thing. Although, obviously, if you're building a service for real, you're probably going to do some kind of authentication. Okay, so let's go off and create the basic project. And it's doing a bunch of work right now and creating the project hierarchy. Okay. We get this little home page that, if you're doing this for the first time, it's well worth poking around here. These are just links off to various web resources that tell you all about building web applications and building web API stuff and so on. There are also some useful links in here to let you publish to sites and so on. This is a new thing in Visual Studio 2017. I'm just going to dismiss that for the time being. If you want to get back to that, by the way, you can just right-click on the web server project and go to Overview. It'll bring that information back, so it's always there. So it's a good reference as you're learning. There's lots of sort of useful links to relevant things. So what did we get? We got a new MVC website, basically. I mean, I can build and run this thing now if I do a build. So we've got a working website. If we just go ahead and run the website, it's building the website just in time. There we go. So there's the website that it created. It's just got some generic information. It has two pages. It has this home page, which we're looking at right now, and then it has this API page. So this is that self-generated help documentation thing that I talked about. We'll dig into how this works a little bit more later. But if I click on the API link, it'll take us to a simple web page that is documenting. So what's happened here is Microsoft have injected a sample service into here for us, and it's called the values service. So there's a class called values controller that's supporting this thing. Okay, so we already have a working website that's got a working web API service. Let's look at the structure of what got created for a little while. So we'll zoom straight in. You'll notice we've got a controllers folder, and as I said, this site is kind of a mixture between MVC and web API. So home controller is an MVC controller for the home page. So when you're looking at the home page, that's the code that's running. So that's not really interesting to us. Values controller is an example of a web API service. If we open it, you'll see public class values controller is an API controller. And it has operations. It has a get operation that returns a collection of strings. It has a get operation that accepts a value that returns a single string. Now it's just hard-coded stuff, as you can see, but it's a sample of a working service. It has a post method. This is a hint that the data is coming from the body, not through a parameter. We'll talk about this in more detail later. Accepts a value, and that would create. Obviously, there's nothing implemented there. And it has a put, which is a update. Again, a put accepts an ID, and then from the body, a string value. And it has a delete, most of which do nothing. But the two get methods do something. But that is an example of a working Web API 2 controller class. We'll come back to that in a little while. We also have a views folder. Again, this is the MVC part of the web application, but basically we have our home page there. So if we wanted to affect the content on that home page, it's just an HTML page. Well, it's actually a MVC layout, but essentially it's HTML. We also have the areas folder. You do need to be aware of the areas folder because in there is the help page support. This is all injected by a separate NuGet package, by the way. So if you do want to add this support to an existing website, you can go off and get the ASP.NET Web API.help package, and it injects this stuff into your project. But we do need to know a little bit about this, and as we go through the exercises, there's some startup code that affects how the help system works. So we will be tweaking a couple of lines of code in here. But generally speaking, other than a couple of little tweaks of the startup code, we're not going to do anything in the C# project. Okay, we're going to do everything in a Synergy.NET project. So we've just got this environment that is able to host things. There is also an app start folder, which is useful to know about, because this is where we have default configuration code. In particular, there is this Web API config. And again, we will tweak a couple of lines of code in here just to make some stuff happen. But we've already seen some of this. Here's our default routing rules being set up. So again, this is the line of code that gives us the basic ability to say /API, /controller name, an optional /value, and route it to the appropriate place. And again, we will tweak a couple of lines of configuration code in here to plug in some functionality later on. But obviously, my goal as a Synergy person is to try and minimize everything I do in the C# side and maximize everything I do in the Synergy.NET side. There is also a models folder, but right now there's nothing in it, but it's provided that for us because, again, the convention is that's where you put your models. Now, again, we're not going to use that. We're going to put our models in the Synergy side, but that's where they would normally go. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that is just the website that's hosting. There is content that's just got a bunch of CSS theming stuff in. There's a few fonts that the Bootstrap theme uses. There's some JavaScript stuff in here that's used by the web apps and the help pages and so on. We don't need to be aware of any of this. It's fairly common to build a website that also provides web services and do both in one container. So if that's the case, then obviously you're going to get intimate with a lot of this stuff. But to do web API services, we don't need to know about any of this stuff. Let's just take a look at the NuGet packages and make sure everything's up to date. So I'm going to right-click on the solution and say Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. These are all the NuGet packages that were installed by the default project template. And you can see some of them will look interesting to us. Microsoft.asp.net.mvc. So it's got MVC support. There's the main one we're interested in. ASP.NET Web API, Web API Client, Core, Help Page, Web Hosting, and so on. Also in here, there's Newtonsoft JSON that Microsoft put in there by default because their code uses it to do the serialization and deserialization. There is jQueries in there and a few other things. Now you'll notice that some of these are out of date. The little blue arrow here says there's an update available. The green ones are up to date. There's 16 updates available. So I'm just going to go off and get all of those to start with and make sure we start up to date. So now it's downloading. What you get when you do a file new project is based on what's available at the time when Microsoft published the project template, and things have moved on since then. So I'm required to accept the licensing terms for the various packages that are being used. This is just bringing them all bang up to date. Okay, so finished. Now we've got the latest versions of everything, no updates pending. everything's got a green check mark. Whenever I do that, let's just do a rebuild solution and make sure it does rebuild. Make sure someone hasn't hosed us. No, they haven't. And let's just run the thing up and make sure it does. So I just did a Control F5 there to launch the site. There we go, and there's our site launching again. And here's the documentation. We'll come back to this later on, but the basic documentation you get for free is useful. It's telling us that it's discovered a service out there called values. So it found that values controller class that we just looked at. And it's telling us within that class, I found public methods that look like operations on a RESTful web service, and there are two available through a GET at API values and API values/ID. There's a post available, a put, and a delete. And then as we drill into each one of these, it will give us information. Now, there's not a great deal of information there. There are mechanisms where we can inject information into this help environment, but it's telling us that its response is a collection of string, and it's giving us an example of what that response would look like in JSON. It's also giving us an example of what that response would look like as an XML format, if that's what we decide we want to use. And it's also, if we drill into something like a post, so this would be how to create, and it's telling us the request format is it's expecting a sample string in that case, because it's just a very simple example, and that's what it would look like in XML format. Okay, so that's basically our basic environment on which we're going to build. I'm going to configure this project to use IIS just so it's running all the time, and right now I'm relying on, down in my task tray, I've got IIS Express running. So I'm just going to close this down and configure the project to use full-blown IIS just so it's always there. So I'm going to go into project properties for the web project. I'm going to go into the web, and I'm going to say I want to use IIS, and it's suggesting a URL of localhost web server. I'm just going to say create virtual directory. So that created that site in my IIS implementation on this machine now. What that looks like on the, so now let's just make sure that's working. So I'm going to launch the application again, and now I'm just looking for the fact that it just says localhost web server now. Before it had a local port number in there for IIS Express. And there we go, there's our app running under IIS. Okay, we should be able to go to the default service. If I say /API/values, then there we go, we just called the web API service. And again, we should also be able to say API values/1 and drill into the get a single one, and there's the hard-coded return value. So our environment's up and running, and we're using IIS. Okay. Just to save us a little bit of time as we're zigging in and out of this service, I'm just going to make a slight change. So I'm going to grab the URL of the help page, and then I'm going to go back to project properties again, and I'm going to tell it that when I start the project, I actually want to start a specific URL and give it the URL of the help page. So it's going to take me to the help page by default now instead of the home page. And let's just make sure that's going to work for us. Okay, so we're going to go straight to the help page. Just a minor thing, but it'll save us a little bit of time later. Okay, so we already looked at values controller. Let me show you some basic stuff that we can do to enhance the API help. So we're just going to stick in that local default controller action for the time being. So I'm going to go to values controller, and you'll notice that when we start this application, we're getting basically no documentation available. Okay? And if we go into something like the get operation, nothing really information about what's going on here. So one of the ways you can improve that in Web API is to use documentation comments. So for example, if I in here put a documentation comment, again we're in C# right now, we'll see this happening in Synergy later, but I'm going to put a summary comment on here, say returns information about values, okay, and then I'm going to put a documentation comment on the get method that says returns all values, and then we'll put a comment on this method that says returns a single value, And further, we've got a parameter here, so the ID of the value to return. Let's put a documentation comment on the post. So this is going to be creating. So we'll say creates a new value, and the parameter is the value to create. And this is updates a value, and the ID of the value to update, and the new value. And finally, on our delete method, if we say deletes a value and the ID of the value to delete. So now we've added some documentation comments. What we need to do is make a little change to the environment. One of the things you can do when you build an application in .NET is that you can request that you are given a XML documentation file. Okay? And what we're going to do is we are going to specify that that documentation file, normally it goes in the bin folder. There's a directory in this web application called app data. So I'm actually going to put it in the app data directory, which is here. So whenever we do a build, it will create an XML file that has all of that documentation in that I just specified. And then what we can do in Web API is we can make a little tweak to the startup environment. So if we go to the areas into the help page, there is a class in here called help page config, which is automatically called by the Web API startup environment. And if we make a simple change in here, and it's fairly well commented as to what's going on, and this one here, config.set documentation provider to an XML documentation provider. So basically, if we uncomment that line and then point it at our file, which ours was called webserver.xml, now Web API's help subsystem will read the XML documentation from the file that's created when we do a build, which is based on the doc comments in the code. Okay? So in theory, if we do a launch of this site, it will build it, and it will run it, and hopefully now we should find that we've now got some documentation for our service. Okay, so we've got a general description of the service. Okay, it's a silly description because it's a silly service, but we've now got descriptions of the operations, returns all values, returns a single value, blah, blah, blah. And as we drill into things like the put, for example, it'll tell us that there is a URI parameter expected called ID, and it is the ID of the value to update, and its type is integer, and it's required. Okay? So it's starting to give us some documentation. We'll be taking this a lot further and showing how you can inject really useful information through these mechanisms and others later on. So let me just show you very briefly. Was as soon as you plug that functionality in, all of a sudden you tend to start to get a bunch of warnings coming out of the C# compiler. Because the environment now knows that we're consuming our documentation comments and doing something useful with them, all of a sudden it starts telling us you're missing a doc comment, you're missing a doc comment, you need to comment this, you need every method, every property, everything it expects to have a documentation comment on it. Which, you know, if it's not something that's actually part of your public API, it's good practice, but you might not care that much. So if you want to just tell the thing to quieten down, if you grab the CS1591, which is the warning number that's coming out, you can go into project properties. Let's do that this way. And if you go onto the build tab, you can tell it to suppress warning CS1591, and now it will shut up a little bit. But it's not going to point out to you that you forgot to put the doc comments in place in your model classes and in your operations, in your controllers where you really should have them. You know, I tend to remember to do that when I'm in the code. So I'll tell it not to bug me about the places that aren't that important.